just after 11 at night on the 14th of January, 1942. Two battered old tugboats crept toward a harbour they had no legal right to enter, crewed by men carrying pistols and grenades, but no orders from their own government to use them. If they were caught, London would call it piracy. If the plan failed, the men aboard could expect a Spanish firing squad, not a court-martial. And the tugs themselves, wallowing unarmed, barely faster than the men who might soon be swimming for their lives, had no business anywhere near what waited in that harbour. Yet within half an hour, 3 enemy vessels would be gone from Santa Isabel, and not a single raider would be killed, wounded, or even seriously delayed. This was Operation Postmaster, and the suicide tugboats at its centre were the Vulcan and the Nuneaton. 2 unglamorous harbour workhorses lent by the governor of Nigeria for a mission so diplomatically radioactive that Britain's own Admiralty had spent months refusing to admit it existed. The men aboard belonged to a unit barely a year old, just 55 strong, built from cast-offs, volunteers, and one deeply unconventional major who had already decided that the normal rules of naval warfare did not apply to him. Their targets were 3 Axis ships tucked into a neutral harbour that Britain was explicitly forbidden to touch. The odds on paper were absurd, and that is exactly why the plan worked. To understand how a pair of tugboats ended up staging one of the strangest coups of the Second World War, you have to go back to the summer of 1941, and to a man named Gustavus March-Phillipps. He was a gunner officer, invalided out of frontline service after wounds and a car accident, and by most conventional measures he should have spent the war behind a desk. Instead, he talked his way into the Special Operations Executive, the secret organization Churchill had ordered to set Europe ablaze, and persuaded his superiors to let him build something entirely new. A small maritime raiding force that could operate where regular commandos and regular warships could not. The unit that emerged, formally designated No. 62, Commando, but known informally as the Maid Honour Force, after the 65-ton Brixham sailing trawler March-Phillipps commanded, numbered barely a few dozen men. Among them were Captain Geoffrey Appleyard, a Cambridge-educated skier and sailor already earning a reputation for cool nerve under fire, and Captain Graham Hayes, alongside a young Danish volunteer named Anders Lassen, a man who had crossed the North Sea to fight for a country that was not his own, and who would go on to earn Britain's highest decoration for gallantry before the war was through. In August 1941, March-Phillipps took a 5-man crew out of Poole in Dorset and sailed the Maid Honour for West Africa, a voyage of extraordinary length for so small a vessel, while the rest of his men travelled out separately by troopship. Their official task, once they reached Freetown in Sierra Leone, was to hunt for evidence that German U-boats were being secretly refueled along the rivers of neutral and Vichy French territory. It was unglamorous, patient intelligence work, the kind that rarely makes the history books. But it put March-Phillipps' men in exactly the right waters, at exactly the right time, to notice something far more interesting than a suspected fuel dump. Working alongside Special Operations Executive agents already based in West Africa, the Maid Honour Force learned of 3 vessels sitting in the harbour of Santa Isabel, on the Spanish-controlled island of Fernando Po, in the Gulf of Guinea, not far off the Nigerian coast. The largest was the Duchessa d'Aosta, an 8,500-ton Italian cargo liner that had been interned there for more than a year. On paper, she was carrying wool and tanning materials. In practice, British intelligence had grown convinced she was something closer to a floating listening post. Her radio equipment capable of tracking and reporting Allied shipping movements out into the Atlantic, where U-boats waited. Suspicion deepened when officials noticed that the first page of her cargo manifest was missing, feeding a belief, never conclusively proven, that she might be carrying war material rather than the innocent goods she claimed. Moored nearby were two smaller Axis vessels, the German tug Likomba and a diesel-powered barge named Bibundi. Together, the three ships represented a small but real thorn in Britain's side, sitting untouchable in a harbour that belonged to a country Britain was desperate not to provoke. That single fact that Fernando Po was Spanish and Spain was neutral was the entire problem. Spain's government leaned openly towards the Axis, and the island's own administration was widely regarded as sympathetic to Franco's fascist allies. Sailing in and simply seizing three ships at anchor would be, by any normal definition, an act of piracy against a neutral power, exactly the kind of provocation that could tip Madrid off its precarious fence and into the war on Hitler's side. And so, when the Admiralty finally approved a plan to deal with the ships in November 1941, it did so on the understanding that it could never officially admit involvement. If anything went wrong, the raiders would be disowned. That, it turned out, was the easy part of the disagreement. The real trouble started closer to home. The operation depended on the governor of Nigeria supplying two tugs, the Vulcan and the Nuneaton, to carry roughly 30 raiders to Fernando Po and back, a mixed force of Special Operations Executive Agents, Commandos from the Maid Honour Force, and local volunteers needed to crew and stoke the tugs themselves. But the British General Officer commanding West Africa, General Sir George Giffard, refused to release the 17 local men the plan required, unwilling either to disrupt his own manpower priorities or to risk his command being associated with what he too regarded as barely disguised piracy. His refusal stalled the operation for weeks. The Admiralty, uneasy about proceeding without full military backing, suspended the plan. The Foreign Office withheld support. Even the British Embassy in Madrid, whose staff would have to manage the diplomatic fallout, wanted nothing to do with it. For over a month, Operation Postmaster existed only on paper, blocked not by the enemy, but by Britain's own institutional caution. It was only in early January 1942 that the Foreign Office reversed course, concluding that some form of British action against the ships had become unavoidable regardless of the risk, and gave the operation its final green light. As a last piece of diplomatic cover, the Admiralty even arranged a cover story in advance. If challenged, London would claim the three vessels had simply been intercepted, attempting to slip back to Axis-controlled Europe. Nothing more sinister than a routine wartime seizure on the high seas. While the politicians argued the groundwork for the raid itself was already being laid, quietly, patiently, by a single Special Operations Executive Agent living under commercial cover on Fernando Po. His name was Richard Lippett, and he had secured a genuine job with the Liverpool shipping firm John Holt and Company, which had legitimate business interests on the island. It gave him a reason to be there, a reason to move freely, and a reason to get to know the men he was quietly preparing to betray. Over the following weeks, Lippett ingratiated himself with the crews of the Duchess d'Aosta and the Likomba, learning their routines, their watch schedules, and, crucially, their taste for a party. Fernando Po was a small, isolated posting, and its handful of European officers were starved for entertainment. Lippert discovered that the ship's crews readily accepted invitations ashore, and that the Duchessa d'Aosta's own officers had thrown a party aboard their vessel as recently as the 6th of January. It gave him an idea, and it gave the raiders their opening. The plan that emerged was almost theatrical in its simplicity. On the night of the raid, Lippert would arrange a lavish dinner party on shore and ensure the ship's officers were invited, drawing as many trained hands as possible away from their vessels at the exact moment the tugs came calling. Everything now hinged on timing, nerve, and the hope that 30-odd men in 2 unarmed tugboats could outmaneuver 3 moored ships without firing a shot loud enough to bring Spanish authorities, or worse, armed resistance, down on their heads. The raiders left Lagos on the 11th of January 1942, the Vulcan and Nuneaton pressing south and east through the Gulf of Guinea with their mixed cargo of commandos, agents, and volunteer crew. Along the way, they rehearsed the boarding maneuvers they would need in the dark, lowering foldbots, the collapsible canvas kayaks that would carry small teams silently up to the anchored ships, and practicing the boarding drills again and again until they became instinct rather than plan. 3 days later, on the 14th of January, Fernando Po's coastline rose out of the Gulf of Guinea ahead of them, and the tension aboard both tugs must have tightened with every mile. Ashore, Richard Lippert had done his work well. That evening, the dinner party he had spent weeks cultivating drew a remarkable haul away from the ships. 12 Italian officers from the Duchessa d'Aosta and 2 German officers from the Licomba, all gathered comfortably on shore, glasses in hand, with no idea that the ships they had left behind were about to be stolen out from under them. By 11:30 that night, the Vulcan and the Nuneaton had taken up position roughly 180 meters outside the harbour, engines idling, waiting for full darkness and the final signal to move in. Then they went in. March-Phillipps took the Vulcan directly toward the Duchessa d'Aosta, with Geoffrey Appleyard at his side as second in command. A handful of crew remained aboard the Italian liner, but as the tug closed the distance, they showed almost no alarm, doing little more than swinging a torch in its direction, apparently assuming this was simply routine harbour traffic. Anders Lassen was among the first men over the rail, and the boarding party spread quickly across the deck, one team planting demolition charges on the anchor chain, while others moved below to search for any crew or prisoners left aboard. At the same moment, on the far side of the harbour, Graham Hayes led a separate team, out from the Nuneaton in their foldbots, paddling silently toward the Licomba and the Bibundi, which lay moored together. A watchman aboard the Bibundi challenged the approaching kayaks, but the raiders talked their way past him, claiming the ship's own captain was among their party and was simply returning aboard. It was enough to buy the seconds they needed. 3 men climbed aboard, and the watch crew, faced with armed strangers, where they expected a returning captain, chose to go over the side into the water rather than fight. With the barge secured, the raiders set explosive charges on its anchor chain and manoeuvred the Nuneaton alongside the Licomba to take both vessels under tow. When the charges went off, cutting the anchor chains in a single controlled blast, the harbour at Santa Isabel erupted into confusion rather than resistance. The explosions were loud enough to draw curious townspeople down to the waterfront, and somewhere in the chaos, anti-aircraft gunners opened fire, apparently convinced the noise signalled an air raid rather than a maritime hijack unfolding under their own harbour lights. Nobody connected the sound to the ships quietly slipping their moorings a few hundred meters away. Despite the racket, despite the crowds now gathering ashore, Not a single person moved to stop the raiders as they took all 3 vessels in tow and turned for open water. From the moment the tugs first entered the harbour to the moment they cleared it, towing 3 captured Axis ships behind them, barely 30 minutes had passed. Not one raider had been killed. Not one had been seriously wounded. 29 prisoners, crew members caught aboard the captured vessels, were now in British hands, and 3 ships that had spent the war so far as a quiet Axis asset in neutral waters were suddenly steaming or being towed toward British-controlled territory. The escape, however, was not entirely without incident. The following day, March-Phillipps established watches over the prize crews and had posted guards on the prisoners, while the small flotilla made for its rendezvous. The Vulcan reached the meeting point with the Royal Navy corvette HMS Violet without further trouble. The Nuneaton was less fortunate, suffering engine failure on the return leg, and having to summon help to be towed the rest of the way into port, a final undignified footnote to what had otherwise been a flawless piece of improvised piracy. It is a detail worth pausing on. The very tugboat that had just helped steal a merchant ship, a tug and a barge from under the noses of 2 Axis crews and a neutral government, could not quite manage the journey home under its own power. Even the smallest of victories in this story came with an asterisk. The diplomatic aftermath was every bit as tense as the planners had feared, if never quite as catastrophic. The Spanish government was furious, viewing the raid correctly as a flagrant breach of its neutrality carried out on its own sovereign territory. Richard Lippert, still on the island and still maintaining his cover as a shipping company employee, was hauled in for questioning by Spanish authorities almost immediately. He managed to convince his interrogators that he had played no part in the disappearance of the ships, and that he had spent none of his own money arranging the party that had so conveniently emptied their decks that night. It was, on the surface, a remarkable piece of nerve, holding steady under direct questioning, while knowing the true story could have ended his war, and possibly his life, on the spot. The Spanish believed him, or at least chose to, but they were not willing to simply let him go. Lippert found himself barred from leaving Fernando Po, effectively trapped on the same island he had just helped betray. Rather than wait to see whether Spanish patience might run out, he slipped away secretly by canoe, making his own quiet, nerve-wracking escape across open water to reach British territory, weeks after the raid that had made him a marked man. Madrid protested loudly through diplomatic channels. It never followed through with retaliation. Whatever anger the Spanish government felt about the violation of its neutrality, it was not, in the end, anger enough to risk war with Britain over 3 ships and a tugboat crew. For Britain, the operation was judged, quietly and without public fanfare, an unambiguous success. The Duchessa d'Aosta was sailed onward to Greenock in Scotland, where she was later placed under Canadian management, and put to work for the Ministry of War Transport under a new name. Her days as a suspected Axis listening post over for good. The Maid Honour herself, the little Brixham trawler that had carried March-Phillipps' men halfway around the Atlantic to make the operation possible in the first place, was eventually left behind in Lagos and sold on to the government of Sierra Leone, ending her naval service far from the cold waters she had first sailed from. The men who had carried out the raid did not go unrecognized. Gustavus March-Phillipps received the Distinguished Service Order for his planning and leadership. Graham Hayes and Anders Lassen were both awarded the Military Cross for their part in seizing the Likomba and the Bibundi. Geoffrey Appleyard already a decorated officer, received a bar to his own military cross. Richard Lippert and fellow agent Leonard Guise were each appointed members of the Order of the British Empire, a quiet, civilian-sounding honour for two men who had just helped pull off an act of state-sanctioned piracy against a neutral power. Operation Postmaster's legacy, though, runs well beyond the medals handed out in its immediate aftermath. It stands as one of the clearest early proofs that Britain's new breed of irregular, small-scale raiding units, the Commandos and Special Operations Executive Teams, that so many senior officers still regarded with suspicion in 1941, could deliver results that conventional forces simply could not reach. A pair of tugboats and a few dozen men working from patient intelligence gathering, a well-cultivated cover story, and the courage to act despite official reluctance at nearly every level of the British chain of command, had achieved in half an hour what months of diplomatic pressure and naval blockade could never have managed without risking exactly the kind of international incident everyone in London was desperate to avoid. It also marked one of the earliest combat outings for Anders Lassen, the young Dane who had crossed the North Sea to fight for a country not his own, and who would go on to earn Britain's highest award for gallantry, the Victoria Cross, before the war's end claimed his life in Italy in 1945. Gustavus March-Phillipps himself would not survive the war either, killed the following year during a raid on the French coast. But the unit culture he built at Poole and carried out to Fernando Po fed directly into the Special Air Service, and the wider commando tradition that Britain would rely on again and again as the war progressed. In the end, the story of Operation Postmaster is not really the story of two tugboats at all. It is the story of what a small number of determined, unconventional people can achieve when official caution fails them and they choose to act anyway. Gambling everything on patience, disguise, and 30 carefully rehearsed minutes in the dark. The ships they stole were modest by the standards of the wider war. The precedent they set was not.